There you are now. Welcome back to the workshop. So on today's episode, I thought we might take a final look at this Salisbury differential. On the last episode, we talked a little bit about the Salisbury and the fact it was a limited slip diff. We talked about the like of the later Tranex diff, and a few people asked me about the ATB torque biasing type differentials. So I want to just finish up on differentials on this video, get this done so that you guys can have hopefully an understanding of how this works. Bear with me on this because it isn't the most straightforward thing to try and explain. So I'm going to use a combination, hopefully, of the whiteboard and actually physically trying to show you this in real time as it happens inside in the gearbox. By the very nature, limited slip differentials are about doing exactly that. We are trying to drive both wheels as much as we possibly can. Unfortunately, because of the way a car takes a corner, it does need to be able to change the speed of the wheel turning on the outside versus the wheel turning on the inside. So one is taking a very long arc, one is taking a very short arc. If you don't or can't change that speed, the car will inherently want to go straight on. The more power you put into an engine, the more likely it is to slip the unloaded wheel in a corner. If you turn into a right-hand down corner, the weight of the car will shift onto the near side left-hand side of the car, and it will unload the offside right-hand side of the car. If you've got a significant amount of power developing in your engine, what will start to happen is the wheel that is becoming unloaded will lose traction and start to slip. Because how an open differential works, that will mean you will lose all drive propelling that vehicle forward. You will be able to go around the corner, but you will start to slip that wheel and you will lose drive because the wheel on the ground will no longer be receiving drive because all of the power will be lost through the slipping wheel. In order to overcome that, we use a limited slip differential. The idea behind the limited slip differential is to, I suppose in a sense, pick up on that slipping wheel and limit how much it slips. But actually, rather than trying to limit how much it slips, we're actually trying to send drive to the wheel that's hard down on the ground. This is done in a few different ways. The Salisbury diff that you can see here on my bench, unfortunately, is an incredibly old design. It seems to be the go-to when anybody talks about limited slip differentials in minis. They say Salisbury because it was obviously popular. Unfortunately, the Salisbury differential came into the mini world at a time when race cars and high performance minis were, to say the least, of an agricultural kind of design. The tyres were cross-ply, the suspension was crude, and the tracks were very bumpy, and as were the roads. So in those days, the differentials, the Salisbury diff in fact, really is a tractor differential taken from the agricultural world, literally. It was a differential that, by its design, spent most of its time actually almost locked, so not actually having any slip, and made a car, especially like the Mini, where the wheels are on the very four corners, incredibly difficult to steer, because generally speaking, the car would want to go straight forward. These diffs, unfortunately, are still all over the place and are in lots of gearboxes. I typically will see 3 or 5 of these every year, depending on how many sort of older race cars I strip down or take apart. I'd love to just wash my hands of Salisbury diffs and stop recommending them. Well, I don't recommend them, but I'd stop working on them and stop seeing them. But, you know, economy and the price of modern, higher quality, more advanced differentials is still very high. Could typically run you 600 or 700 euros for a differential like that. And when you start getting into replacing differentials on top of rebuilding an engine or a gearbox, it gets very expensive. So I thought I'd put this video out just to let people know kind of some of the pitfalls in these types of differentials and give you kind of an understanding of how they work so that you can probably better make a decision. One of the things I have experienced in my workshop here is people bringing these Salisbury differentials to me, which they've bought on somewhere like eBay or one of the sort of Facebook groups or something like that, with the intention that this is going to be a really great performance upgrade for their vehicle, but then finding that actually it just makes the car really horrible to drive, and you know, for their needs and their uses really is not help. So maybe if we look at it from this angle, you'll at least understand what you're buying into, and then you can make the decision so that if you do buy one of these differentials, you can at least be, you know, aware of what you're taking on or the problem you might be looking at. So limited slip differentials limit that slipping of the wheel in one of two possible ways. One is what we call preload in the clutch pack, and the other is using ramp angles to further increase that load. If I show you what we have here, we have one of those clutch packs. And the clutch pack, as I explained to you on the last video, is of kind of two parts. You've got the inner driving rings, these ones, and you've got the outer locking rings, the ones here with the tab. So if I kind of give you an exploded view of that, what you're going to see is you've got outers, inners, outers, inners, outers, and then obviously the inner. One set of these plates is connected to the wheel, and the other set of these plates is connected to the housing of the differential. When both wheels are driving, all of this is tumbling over one on top of itself, one on top of itself, one on top of itself. If I try and stop this wheel, in order for that wheel to stop and the other wheel to stay driving, what has to happen is the inner has to turn and the outers have to stay still. If I preload this clutch pack, in other words, I put pressure on it, I try and squash it together, what that's going to create is friction between each one of these plates. That friction is going to resist allowing them to slip over each other, making them want to turn together, effectively locking up the differential or stopping the differential from working. So I can affect how much slip is allowed between one wheel and the other by how much pressure is put on this plate when I put the differential together. I'll show you on the diff how we would do that or how we would change that. But for the moment, that's the concept. What is inside these diffs is a number of those inner and outer plates, and then one plate which is what we call a bevel spring. So I think you can see that hopefully on the camera, that plate is not flat but actually has a sort of concave convex shape. It's not entirely flat. If I use something like my spanner to put across it, you can see that it's high in the middle and low on either sort of side, on the outside edge. So when this is put together in the differential, what has to happen is that plate has to flatten out in order for this all to fit together. The flattening out of that plate is what creates preload, what holds this whole clutch pack together. A bit like if you remember when we did the video, and I'll put a link to it in the corner here, I think it's actually in that corner. When we did the clutch videos, we had the diaphragm that we were pressing down and we were trying to set the preload on that diaphragm. Well, that's exactly what's going on here in these clutch packs. It's creating preload, which is the first limit of slip. Now, we can only set that preload to a certain amount, because if that preload is too high, we'll effectively completely lock the diff up. So what we actually need to get is an increase in reactionary preload. In other words, when we turn into a corner, if we're turning into a very gentle corner, we'll get some slip and it's no problem. But if we turn into a really tight corner and the inside wheel wants to spin and the outside wheel wants to completely stop because it's under massive load, we want to try and drive some of that drive into that massively loaded wheel. And we do that in limited slip differentials using a thing called ramp angles. We'll go to the whiteboard now and I'll try and explain ramp angles, and then I'll demonstrate it on this actual diff. Okay, we're over at the trusty whiteboard and I'm going to try and use this to explain. Now, please forgive me because my drawing is far from, I don't know, SolidWorks, CAD, 3D or any of those. But hopefully, if I explain to you what I've tried to draw here, it'll help me to explain ramp angles and then I can demonstrate it over on the actual differential. So these here are the wheels. This is the drive shaft. These are the Hardy Spicer couplings. And this linear drawing here is the guts of the differential. The purple squares, imagine them like the outer housing of the diff. The one that the crown wheel is going to be attached to and the one that's going to spin around. Imagine the red plates here as the ones that I showed you in the stack up, the clutch plate stack up that we've seen inside. The inner ones. Imagine these green lines as the outer ones, and you can see there's that bevel spring that I told you about that would have to be squashed to give the differential preload. So if we turn right hand in, the load is all going to transfer onto this wheel, giving this the most amount of traction. The load will come off of this wheel here, allowing it to lift and want to spin. The differential wants to spin head over head, turning both wheels at the same time. If this wheel stops and this wheel tries to spin, what has to happen is the internals of the differential, the sun wheels and the pinions, have to turn on over each other. The preload that will be on the differential will try and resist that, but we can only have that so much because we need to allow the car to go around the corner. So the clever thing about most limited slip differentials is they use a set of ramps built in to the pins or the cross pins in the diff that hold the planet gears. Now I'll explain this again when we have the planet wheels in our hand. I just want to get the concept of how the ramp angles work first, and then we can go and actually see the whole lot together. One side of the housing will have this sort of V groove in it, which the pin of the planet will sit into, and the other side will have a space, nothing there, just an opening. The opposite set of pins will have the same thing. So in a limited slip differential, you've got 4 planets and 2 suns. So this one this way will have V grooves on one side, and this one this way will have V grooves on the other side. What then happens is, this wheel wants to spin, this wheel is stopped. We want to get drive to go in through the gear and out this way to turn this wheel. We want to get this wheel turning. As this wheel tries to slip, it will spin faster than this wheel. What will happen then is that this ramp angle here will try and force that pin that way. If it tries to force that pin that way, it will increase the load on these clutch packs. So it'll put more load on those clutch packs because it'll close it up. What that extra load will do will try and stop that wheel and get it turning with this wheel. This wheel wants to spin. As it tries to spin freely, the clutch pack puts force on here and tries to close that clutch pack together and force this wheel to turn with this wheel. Well, actually it tries to turn the whole diff head over head. It locks the differential out. As it starts to do that, the more this wheel spins and the more this wheel stops, the more force is generated here in this ramp, and that ramp forces them apart. So you'll hear on modern diffs the thought of opening and closing ramps. Well, the Salisbury diff just has an opening ramp. It doesn't have closing ramps. So what that basically means is, if you have a Salisbury diff set up that it's working correctly, as you turn into a corner and the wheel starts to try and spin, the diff will try and lock and it will try and turn the wheel that is not spinning. That's great. If you lift off the throttle, it'll immediately completely relax the diff and the wheel that is unweighted will start to spin again. Now, what the effect of this is, it will give you what they call snap oversteer. So basically, you will put steering input in, the car will start to turn around the corner or understeer, so sliding straight on. You'll lift the throttle because the car is sliding straight on, and then all of a sudden the drive will come off this wheel, it'll be allowed to slow down, and the car will suddenly try and turn around the corner. The result in that is what we call snap oversteer, which makes the back of the car feel like it slides out and the front of the car comes around, and it makes the car quite difficult to control under power. So one of the things that a driver has to get used to with something like a Salisbury limited slip diff is being very sure-footed. If you go on the power with a Salisbury diff, you've got to be smooth, and a lead foot will not work, because if you keep the shoe in hard, the car will understeer, then when you lift off, it will oversteer. If you watch older type driving techniques, if you see an in-car video of it, what you will see is you'll see the driver throw the car in and then let off steering. Throw the car in and then let off steering. What he's doing is, you can't see this, but he's actually lifting off the throttle when he lifts off of the steering to try and stop the car from oversteering. So he is counter steering. Quite a complex process, and makes it very much a skill to drive a car with a diff like this. Modern diffs have what's called a opening and a closing ramp. It's the closing ramp that brings drive across, but an opening ramp can also do the same. It holds the diff somewhat locked together as it's unloading. So you don't get this snap release. You get a gentle release or a really progressive release. So the car will progressively release and start to turn more. In a differential like that, in a plate differential with opening and closing, you get this lovely ability to almost steer a front wheel drive car like it's rear wheel. You can actually steer it on the power. You can put in a steering input, and then as the car starts to understeer, you can lift off, the car will come around a bit more, and if you think you've got a shot to go through the corner, you can put the boot back down again and the car will drive through the corner. Unfortunately, that is very difficult on a Salisbury because they tend to snap release. They lock up, drive the car, drive that wheel that's spinning, but then if you lift off the throttle, they snap release and you get this kind of oversteering effect. That can be tuned to a point with the preload on the diff. If you add a little more preload, it takes some of that out of it. But the more preload you add into a diff like this, the more the car will want to understeer in corners, the more it will want to go on straight. What we'll do now is we'll take you back over to the diff, and I want to just show you that in actual action again. I'll just give you a little look at that actually working in physical. And then we can talk a little bit about ATBs. So we're back over at the bench and I have my Salisbury here. And I'm going to try and demonstrate to you this locking action and how the ramps lock or increase the resistance to slip in the differential. So if I take one half of this differential apart, just the top half, just note before I take this away that this is going to be bolted completely true. So we're going to have a bunch of bolts that go between one side of this diff and the other, and they're holding this whole cage together. So if anything changes in this clutch pack, it will be trying to expand. Obviously, because the diff is bolted together, there will be a resistance to that expansion, and it is from that resistance that we get an increase in locking under a wheel slipping event. So the ramp angle is this V here. So you can see there's a V here, and that V is where the differential pin will sit. The angle up this side and the angle up this side is the ramp angle. And that angle is the one that's going to have the pin sitting in it. And as the pin tries to stop and the diff tries to turn, it is going to try and rise up that ramp angle. I'm going to try and show you that here to give you a bit of an idea. So if I simulate the wheel trying to stop, what you're seeing is the lifting of the pin. So you can see there the pin lifting up. And what hopefully you can see is that this cage here is being forced upwards. It's being forced up in this direction. By forcing that cage up in that direction, I am trying to compress the cage into this housing. The housing is completely bolted together, so there's nowhere for the housing to go. So all I do is I increase the clamping force on these clutch plates. If I increase the clamping force, I'm getting more friction, and more friction is going to try and stop the wheel that's spinning. If it stops the wheel that's spinning, what happens then is the whole diff tries to turn and drive the wheel that is not slipping, or the wheel on the other side, the very much loaded wheel. Now, talking about the fact that there's very little tunability in a Salisbury diff, is that we could effectively change this ramp angle. By making this ramp angle slightly more shallow, we would make the diff want to rise up earlier. In other words, making the diff more prone to locking. The other thing I could do is I could make that ramp angle steeper. So I could grind this ramp angle so it's steeper, making the pin want to stay in the groove and not rise up. Changing that angle, and you can see somebody has definitely changed that angle by the fact that there's this kind of nub here in the middle. Somebody has been in here with a grinder or a milling machine or something like that, and they've changed this angle to make it steeper. Why they're doing that is to try and make that diff more progressive, to make it lock less easily. Obviously, the steeper that angle is, the harder it is for the pin to drive up it, the less aggressive the diff will be. The shallower you make that angle, the more aggressive the diff will be to lock, and the more it'll try and drive the car straight on and make it more likely to understeer. So somebody's been in here before me and they've ground this angle out, they've shallowed this angle out to try and make the diff less snatchy, or to make the diff less violent in operation. Another way you can tune the Salisbury diff is you could reduce preload. Now preload, like I said, is set by a bevel washer, and that bevel washer would sit deep down in this housing against here. If you wanted to reduce some preload on the diff, you could machine this surface here in a lathe to reduce some of the preload. If you reduced or machined this surface, you would reduce how much clamping load was put onto this spring, and that would take away some of the aggression of the diff in an open straight line. But remember, the more you reduce preload, the more likely the diff will be to slip in the corner, and a diff that slips more in the corner will be more likely to have a snap reaction on the diff pin. On the cross pin. If it has a snap reaction on the cross pin, it could make the diff very difficult to anticipate what it's going to do. So anytime I get one of these Salisbury diffs, one of the things I try and do to make them a little less snappy or a little less sharp is I alter the configuration of this clutch pack. So right now the clutch pack is in this order. It's got an inner plate, an outer plate, an inner plate, an outer plate. One of the things that I've found over the years to make these a little less aggressive is if you combine two inner plates and then an outer and an outer, what you effectively do is you take out one friction surface. Taking out that one friction surface can give the diff a little bit more ease of driving on a straight line, but not affect how it locks up in corners. It also affects how it releases in corners and makes it a little more forgiving as it releases in the corner, because as that diff unlocks, it gives it that sort of slightly more gentle feel, or gives it that slightly more progressive feel. As I said, in the much more modern diffs, like something like this Tranex or copy of the Tranex diff, this diff has much more progressiveness in it for two reasons. One, it uses much more clutch plates and much less preload. And secondly, it has an opening angle and a closing angle, allowing the diff to be tuned both for how it locks and how it unlocks. Whereas the Salisbury, unfortunately, has more of a tendency to lock straight up or unlock. The last thing to talk about is the ATB. But just before I do that, I'd just like to thank all of our subscribers. We just recently went over 3,000 subscribers, and if you told me that was going to be the case a few months ago, I would be blown away and completely amazed. In fact, I'd have told you it wasn't going to happen. So thank you very much to everybody who's subscribed. And to those new people, I see you trickling in every day. You are most welcome. I hope you enjoy the channel. Have a look around. We don't always go into this super technical detail. Sometimes we're more a how-to, putting things together. Other times we're looking at projects here in the shop, and other times we are having a chat on our live stream and talking about what's coming up and looking at topics. By the way, thank you to everybody who tuned into the live stream and had a chat with myself and Cole. We really did enjoy having a look at different suspension. You have posed some questions, and I absolutely promise you they will be brought up to the fore again soon. Don't forget to hit the like button on the channel. It really does help us. We're trying to grow the channel so that more people and more mini enthusiasts, more auto enthusiasts and more car enthusiasts get to see what it is we do and help us then to make more videos. Thank you to everybody, by the way, who also donates to our coffee account. It really does help. And thank you to everybody who buys merch. It is great to see our logos and to see our t-shirts on people around, and to get a chance to talk to you. If you do see me, don't forget to give me a beep or a wave, and I'll more than happily have a chat with you. I'd talk to a wall if they'd listen. Okay, let's go back to talking about these ATB diffs. The ATB diff is a sort of hybrid between a plate diff and an open diff. ATB stands for automatic torque biasing. And rather than trying to stop slip, what the ATB does is it uses helical cut gears and the torque reaction that is created between two helical cut gears to lock up one side or the other of the differential. You could imagine it a bit like a wedge. If you have two gears together and they're inside a housing, and you try and drive one gear against the other, the natural reaction is for those gears to be forced apart. They want to try and force apart. If they are inside a constrained housing, as they try and force apart, they are going to come in contact with the outside wall of the housing, and that housing is going to try and stop those gears from turning. Friction will be created. In the automatic torque biasing diff, the helical cut gears are long. They spread both sides of the housing. They are driven either side by the wheel, and then in turn by the crown wheel driving both of the main wheels forward. If one wheel tries to stop, it is going to make the gears inside the ATB try and spread apart. They are then going to touch the housing, and that is going to make them try and drive that wheel. So it doesn't work to completely lock up a wheel like a plate diff could, but it certainly will bias torque to a wheel that is stopped versus a wheel that is in motion. A lot of people ask me, what is the best choice of diff for a road going tuned Mini? And that question I wish was black and white, so I could just give a specific answer. But actually what you will find is there is so many variants in what exactly it is you are going to do. Are you driving that Mini just to have a B-road blaster? Are the roads you drive on sharp, windy and rough? Or are they smooth, open and fast? Do you spend a lot of time driving in town? Do you spend a lot of time driving out on motorways? All of those are varying factors and will completely change the choice of differential you might go with. If it was a back road blaster that you took out twice a month to just absolutely drive the life out of, and you wanted to get the best sensation of cornering speed, then a mildly set up plate diff would very definitely give you that. But remember, it will be a handful. It will have a really terrible turning circle, so it won't be nice in town. And it will have that on-off reaction when you lift off the throttle, meaning if it's tight roads with traffic, it's going to be a scary experience. The other thing you have to remember is a lot of roads around the world have a sort of a hump in them to allow the water to run off the road so that you aren't driving in a puddle. That will be very much emphasized by a plate differential because it will feel that change in road surface, and what it will make the car want to do is be in the middle of that hump all the time. Well, when you're driving, you can't drive down the middle of the road. Everyone gets real angry and they beep and flash at you, and eventually the police come and tell you to take away your license or give you penalty points. So you're going to have one wheel down in the hump and one wheel up on the hump, and that will make for an unpleasant drive in a plate diff. An automatic torque biasing diff will pick that up, but it won't be as severe and it'll be more manageable. So I suppose I wish, as I said, it was black and white and I could absolutely give you the dead cert what you need. Unfortunately, it's something that is going to be specific. Finally on that, or the last thought I'll leave you with on that, is also how your suspension is set up and what the kind of tires you use will also affect the kind of differential you'll want. If you have a very hard, high mileage tire, like let's say something like the Yokohama 008 that's very popular in the Mini world on 10-inch wheels, that tire has a limit to its grip. So it'll be more forgiving on a harsh differential because the wheels will inherently want to slip more anyway. So it won't feel as harsh. If you had something like, let's say, stick with the Yokohama brand, the AO32 in a soft compound, that will vastly exaggerate any sort of differential feeling. So if you have a diff that feels or is inclined to feel very tight and very wound up, and then you couple it with a really grippy tire, it will really exaggerate the experience of that differential. Change the size of your wheel and then that brings it all happening as well. Change your suspension geometry, like for example caster, will have a massive effect on how a differential feels. So really and truly, the topic, as you can see, is a complete minefield, and I could probably spend hours and hours talking about it. And I will more than happily make more videos on it if you guys want to go deeper into it. For example, how suspension might affect the differential, how different wheels, different geometry, different tire combinations. I'll more than happily make those videos for you guys if they're what you want. So get into the comments section below and give me the information. Let me know what you want. Also, I'd love to know other people's experiences. So if you have experiences of limited slip differentials, put them in the comment section below and I'll have a listen to them. I'll have a talk with you guys about them because it's always something I like to hear. And give me your opinion on what we say. Alrighty, we're going to leave it at that and I'll see you guys on the next one.